Welcome to the inaugural recording of Each Bring a Poem. Today I have with me Julie Marie Wade, and I will introduce her in my own way because I know her relatively well. She is a professor at my alma mater, Florida International University, and she is an all-around fantastic mentor, and she was I say chair, but I think the correct term is director of my final project for my MFA. She has graciously agreed to join me in my first attempt at this endeavor, and now I will read her official bio. Julie Marie Wade is a member of the creative writing faculty at Florida International University in Miami, a winner of the Marie Alexander Poetry Series and the LaMotta Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir. Her collections of poetry and prose include Wishbone, A Memoir in Fractures, Small Fires, Essays, Postage Due, Poems and Prose, Poems, When I Was Straight, Same Sexy Marriage, a novella and poem, an all-time favorite, Just an Ordinary Woman Breathing, and Skirted. Her collaborative titles include The Unrhymables, Collaborations in Prose, written with Denise Duhamel, and Telephone Essays in Two Voices, written with Brenda Miller. Wade makes her home in Dania Beach with her spouse, Angie Griffin, and their two cats. Her newest project is Fugue, an oral history, out now from Diagram and New Michigan Press. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you for having me, Yael.
So I forgot to say who I was. I am Yael Aldana. I'll categorize myself as an emerging writer. I'm emerging from my MFA with several publications of note, we'll say. And I wanted to do this project because I love reading poetry. Other people's poetry really inspires me. And from what I can tell, it's sort of the Florida International University way of prompting poems out of students to read other poems and get your prompts that way versus, I have to say, I am fascinated by prompts though, like throw blue at a ladder and everybody's angry, you know, like those kind of poems really amuse me. But I really wanted to talk to other people about the poems they love and the poems that I love. So that's how this project came about. But Julie, I did want to ask you a question about your latest published project, I believe, Fugue, an oral history. Now, when I say oral, people in their minds are hearing probably oral, O-R-A-L, but it's actually A-U-R-A-L. And so this title contains one of my favorite words, which I'll get to in a second, fugue. But I wanted to talk to you about your choice of an oral history, because there's a twist on the meaning in there, as well as touching on oral, the other word. So I wanted to talk to you about that choice.
Well, so aural, like A-U-R-A-L, for me it's a synonym for sonic, right? Like the aural sense, like the listening sense. But it does sound like oral. So when we think of a history that is like an oral history, I guess we think of a history that's handed down in words, you know, of someone telling someone a story, or then that story is passed down and so forth, perhaps even in poem form. But aural, A-U-R-A-L, it is a clue to the fact that the book isn't just about a celebration of words, but that it's also about getting to words as sounds in themselves. And so one of the things I say to my students a lot, and you've sat in with my undergrads, you've seen, you know, kind of how we begin a lot of classes, and, you know, how often we just forget to include sensory details, and new students may be learning to differentiate like an abstract noun like love or grief from a concrete noun, like a person, a place, a thing, something that we can experience with our senses. And then after we start doing more work with concrete nouns and more sensory details, the next inevitable thing is that we notice that the majority of our descriptions tend to be rooted in the eyes, right? Like visual details, optical details. And so the kind of shift of trying to get more sonic or aural, or trying to get more, gustatory, olfactory, tactile, like how do we bring the other senses to bear? This book is about prioritizing the aural sense all the way through. So it doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of sensory details, but that the entire focus of the project was, how can I be more aurally attuned, and look at the world by listening to it. Listen, with listening as my primary mode of attention.
That makes perfect sense. Which brings me to the other word in that stands out for me in that title, fugue. Now that's one of my favorite words for a random reason. I'm sure I read this somewhere where someone was in a fugue state,
Yes.
which meant that they were out of it. They didn't know what was going on. But just sonically, that word, there's something about fugue. And I've never used that word myself, but it always rattles around in my mind, a fugue state. So I would like you to talk about how that word relates to the title as well.
So I too first learned about fugue in context, I think probably of a psychology class about the fugue state. And then I had this feeling of, it was like a word deja vu feeling, like, wait, this is the first time I feel like I'm consciously learning about the word fugue, but I also have this sense that I've heard it before, that I know it from some other time in my life. And it turns out I did know it and had forgotten it, but I knew it in a musical context. So there is a fugue. And when I was a piano student, it was one of those many, many words, like kinds of musical compositions that I had studied. And I remembered, like, I had even taken these tests in my piano school. Like, we had these tests every year of, like our musical glossaries, like were we learning the language of music, and could we sight read? And there were all these dimensions, actually, including aural dimensions, where we had to listen to songs played and see if we could identify if it was major or minor, or what the key was, or what the song was. So there were all these levels of testing, and somehow I knew fugue was a musical word, and I had like a relationship with it as a musical word. And then, funnily enough, I forgot that I had a relationship with it. And fugue is also an extreme state of forgetting, where you sort of enter a state of not even knowing perhaps who you are or where you are. And so I basically had a fugue about fugue, and then it became this multivalent word where I thought, wow, like I'm working on a book about sound, I'm working on a book about music. Here's fugue, and it's a kind of musical composition, but it's also, I guess in some sense, every artist's worst nightmare is to have a fugue and to forget, who they are, what their art is about, what they're about. And so it came to be a really like fitting word for the project, because it has that two ways of striking the ear, and two ways of meaning to the hearer.
Wow. So yeah, I was today years old when I found out it was a musical term, because I tend to skew things in my mind. So I looked it up to make sure that my understanding of the meaning was actually the meaning. And then it had like the two listings for a musical, and then like a mental state.
Yes.
So I think people could gather from how this conversation is going that it's gonna be informal and unwieldy. I want to warn people that there might be a myriad of pet gyrations happening behind me at any moment. So yeah, this is meant to be a natural conversation with word nerds, and we're having some very Virgo moments with words, which I love. I could do this all day. But Julie, let us hear what poem you picked. I'm dying to know.
All right. I've been asked not to preface the poem, so I'm only going to show the book it comes from. It comes from the book Bardo, the debut poetry collection by Suzanne Paola, and the poem is called Tenure at 40. November morning in Bellingham, 40 degrees, leaf meal crusted and frost. Each step cracks a little bone. My neighbors have put plasticine on the windows for the cold. I'm checking the thermostat and the pilot light, getting the flues cleaned, thinking of nothing else, thinking of how I'm thinking of nothing else, how the outer life has become the inner, the skin, the body. I lean forward to adjust the curtain, shocked for once to be here and not there, to have walked through the 6 realms and somehow, without knowing it, have chosen, and a corpse lies, done with her bardo journey. 5'6", 100 pounds, large boned, each hand wearing the precise imprint of a lit cigarette as if glimpsing a future need for proof. Cliffhanger without ending, nights I can't quite remember, dragged out of the Capitol Theater in Passaic by the manager, OD'd, my friend's gone. OD'd again on methadone, bloody at the lips, unconscious in a basement, awake in a hospital room. Lyric girl who leapt from one image to the next. Like species consciousness, this memory, like knowing an earlier stage of evolution. Neanderthal girl with rabbit fur coat, the red-lipped mammal girl, the reptile all cold blood and lidless staring. This then is narrative, iron bluish light of mid-morning, no sun, nothing that could be called illumination, just a change in tint from the tint of nighttime. Mountains somewhere, perhaps, their veins against pale horizon. Neighbors, perhaps, fog banks more visible than landscape, more fraught with a line. As if I chose to live where the gods do, veiled from any overwhelming splendor. We're each a piece of spirit, she said on television. We're in like a flesh suit. I pull on nude pantyhose to stand before the dean. Tenure meaning held. He reads my file, where it ends with service to the community, local, where it begins with a name. And the letter we formally recommend be granted, and my students half asleep, the room dotted with paper cones of coffee. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, the psyche of Keats, Isabella who planted basil in a pot with a human head, these stories. The book opens, the cover has bled into the pages. The cover is the book, and the story I see in the figure, their bored eyes give back to me. Middle-aged, a powder blue suit, pumps, necklace of impossible moments. I can just see it, she said. A woman who came back from death and couldn't stop telling it and forgot why. Like gloves or something, it just comes off.
Wow, that was an incredible poem. So can you talk about, before you start to dig in as to why you brought this poem, and why you chose to read it, why did you pick this one?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yeah, there's a story here. So, way back in 2001, I graduated from college in the spring and I was starting a Master of Arts in English program in the fall. And I had applied and boldly declared myself a poet, even though at that time I'd had a lot of literature classes in poetry and had earned a BA in creative writing, but my focus had actually been autobiographical writing in prose. So I thought of myself as a poet, but I didn't really have much training as a poet at the time. And there were a lot of things I didn't know, and there were a lot of things I kept learning that I didn't know. And one of the things that now, it just seems so obvious, but I have to remember it wasn't obvious then. I had not connected the dots that the people who'd been teaching me as when I was an undergraduate student, or the people who were going to be teaching me in grad school, if you were teaching someone how to practice an art form, there's a very good chance that you are also practicing that art form. And somehow it didn't dawn on me that my professors of creative writing were probably writing and publishing books of creative writing of their own. And I just hadn't made that leap yet. And when I got to my program and I started taking classes there, a student, Allison Andrunas, I will always be grateful. She was a fellow MA student. She was a bit older than I was and more knowledgeable than I was about a lot of things. And she said, you know, have you looked up, because I was about to take my first poetry workshop with Suzanne Paola, you know, have you read her book? And I said, what? She has a book. Like, it was just incredible. Like, I couldn't believe that my professors could be authors. And so Allison said, yeah, you know, and she won the Brittingham Prize for her first full-length collection. She also has 2 poetry chapbooks out. I didn't know what a chapbook was. I didn't know what the Brittingham Prize was. I had a lot to learn. So I went to the library at Western Washington University in Bellingham, and I put into WorldCat Suzanne Paola's name. And sure enough, Petitioner, her chapbook, Glass, her chapbook, and then this book, Bardo, popped up. And I started doing this with all my professors and finding their books. And then, of course, the library typically had their books. So I went and got this book, and I could not believe that my professor had written a book, published a book, won a major prize for the book in 1998, so just a few years before. And so I was reading the book and I was astonished. I didn't know what the Bardo was, so I had to learn about the Bardo. But I was reading this book and I was just so stunned by how deeply the poems in general resonated. They were a lot, in many cases, longer than I thought a poem could be. They had segmentation in them, which I knew essays could have. I'd seen that in prose. I'd done that in prose. I didn't know that poems could do that. I was used to like every poem just fitting on a page and having a certain kind of like left aligned situation. And Suzanne's poems, you know, spread out on the page. She used different kinds of section breaks and caesuras midline that I hadn't seen before. She was doing things visually that I had never seen, and aurally, sonically, that I had never heard. And I was just stunned. And now when I had to choose a poem and I thought of this book, I, you know, have gone back to it year after year after year and have my own copy now, of course. But I was really struck at how much, like, I still have my corners folded down from the first time I read that poem in my own copy, and how much I loved Tenure at 40. And it's really funny because I first read that poem when I was 22 years old. I actually didn't know what tenure was. I didn't know I was going to become a professor and ultimately go through tenure and be on the other side of tenure. And I don't think at 22 I had ever imagined being 40, and I have since gone through 40 and I'm on the other side of 40. So I never really imagined either of those things or knew what it would be to be tenured or to be 40. And I think that that's the most beautiful thing in rereading the poem for me, is that, oh my goodness, how could a poem resonate with someone who wasn't a professor in her 40s, like a tenured professor who's been through the process like I am now? And to realize that that poem meant as much to me then, maybe it meant differently, but it was that realization that a poem that didn't on the surface have anything to do with my own lived experience of the world could transcend, because of language and image, my circumstances. And that was really powerful, because I was used to thinking like, oh, you love a poem when it feels like it's about you, or when the author's subject position and experience, as you know, represented, I guess, in the speaker of the poem, when that looks like your life. And this was the first time where the poem, maybe it was prescient because I did eventually get tenure and become a professor myself, but it wasn't on my radar then, any of that. But the poem still spoke to me across those seemingly very different life paths that Suzanne Speaker and I were on.
You know, it's incredible because when I read my poem, I was coming from a similar place. And the poem had a similar, the poem I'm going to read has a similar effect on me. I mean, when you read it, first of all, it was like a longer poem, which I love, but it always freaks me out a little bit because, again, like once you start to have a longer poem, it's unexpected. And this particular one, just the span of it is amazing. And I love a poem that's unafraid to uh, go through different timelines and is not restrictive. So this feels like her poem feels like it's really spanning a larger period of time. And now we're going to use some poetry speak. The voltas in there, you know, I love it because it's like, so we're going along, and a volta in a poetry context is a turn in the poem. And so we're going along, and then, oh, we switched, and oh, we switched again, you know, which I love. So can you talk to some of the specific aspects of the poem that really resonates with you? Let's really get our poem nerd hats on.
I would love to do that. This poem has, maybe it first resonated with me coming out of an undergrad program where I had not been taking poetry workshops, but had been taking prose workshops. I guess maybe even though the poem is written in stanzas, they're not, there isn't a strict pattern of stanza length. So, right, it's not all quatrains or sestets. The stanzas sort of vary in length, but they have segmentation. There are two different moments where there's a fleuron. It's a kind of unique symbol in this book that separates the sections. So it could be, you know, an asterisk or another kind of more familiar symbol, but these are like personalized symbols to this project, and they appear throughout the book, which I had never seen before at the time and really liked it. But I had seen, you know, essays that were obviously paragraphs, not stanzas, but that were segmented. And I liked that built in a pause, and it built in a sense for the reader that there was some kind of, I guess, official turn. And then, even though at the time I didn't know the word volta, and then of course there are like subtler voltas here too that aren't cued by the presence of the fleuron and the full break. But I think for me, a lot of the connection to the poem initially was what you said about its scope, that I didn't realize a poem, like there's this arc here where we start with the title. So we know like the occasion of the poem is tenure at 40, like coming up for tenure as a 40-year-old person. We get to know the speaker, female speaker, you know, coming up at the title's telling us something that comes to a culmination at the end as she's standing in front of the dean, and we recommend formally be granted, like she's getting this thing that is sought after, the tenure. So we have like an arc between knowing it's coming, or at least it's going to be addressed, and then its culmination at the end. But that on a big milestone moment, like even though I didn't know at the time exactly what tenure was, I understood it was something academic, that it seemed important, like it was some kind of milestone that happened if professors had done a good job for some certain amount of time. And so I could sort of translate from that, like, okay, when you have a milestone in your life, you inevitably think about other milestones. You think about like the endless question, how did I get here, like to this moment? And so when I get to the end of the poem, and the speaker is describing herself as middle-aged, a powder blue suit, pumps, necklace, and then that's where the line in jams, of impossible moments. So everything is very literal in that moment, right? Like, okay, I'm middle-aged, I'm wearing a powder blue suit, I'm wearing pumps, I'm wearing a necklace, except it's a necklace of impossible moments. And for me, that's a heartline where then and now of like, what are all the impossible moments that brought this speaker, but also, you know, we identify in poems, we identify with the speaker, even if their experience is so different than ours. So it's like, well, what are my impossible moments? What is my necklace of impossible moments? And that gives me a way to go back, because a necklace is circular, right? And this poem just sort of invites, when you reach that moment, going back and thinking like, oh, these are the impossible moments. And I loved the depth of a speaker who could tell me, you know, these are glimpses, like incredibly vivid, visceral glimpses of my past. And I've had all these moments, you know, there's two references to ODing in these various places, the unconscious in a basement, the awake in a hospital room, all these moments where we presume that the speaker didn't expect to survive and that others didn't expect the speaker to survive. But now the speaker is standing in front of a dean at a university waiting to be tenured in this milestone. And that question, like, how did I go from being that lyric girl to living my life. Now I'm middle-aged. I have a home, I have dress up clothes, I have a professional position, and I'm standing, in a sense, being judged as you are by an academic board. But like, how did I get here? And I guess without even articulating it then, that question of how did I get here? How did I end up in a master's program? My family would have wanted me to be doing something else, not studying English. How did I end up, where I am then? And the beauty of this poem is that, of course, it keeps inviting every reader to ask, what is my necklace of impossible moments? As they approach the speaker's age at the time of the poem, as they go past it, like there's always that circular question: how did I get here? How could I possibly have gotten here from there to here? And even though we lived every day of our own lives, it's so strange how we talk about fugue, right? Like how we sort of forget, like, how did I get here? How did this happen? And I love that this poem can contain that, like the speaker's autobiographical arc, but also in a poem that's just 2.5 pages.
The poem just randomly also has one of my other I have a lot of favorite words, but it has fraught in there. And I have to prevent myself from using fraught too much. That's one of my overused words. But I love the contrast in her life of talking about times where she OD'd, and then here she is a professor coming up for tenure. Because when I was a youth, we would read all of these. You know what? I don't think they were real. These sort of pseudo autobiographical things about girls, like shacking up all over the place and just living these crazy lives. And you think, man, that's wild and crazy. But then you think, how do you ever get out of that? I mean, is that your life? How can you turn that into like a more traditionally successful narrative life? So the contrasting of that, and now that I'm older, I have experience with people who are close to me who struggle with addictions, and when you were reading that sort of thrust me right into that world, that space where you're with that person and they're in the throng of their addiction, and you're just trying to get them from one day to the next day, and sometimes you think, how are they ever going to make it out of this? Because it's just a minute to minute, day to day type thing. So the fact that, first of all, I was surprised. So she started with winter, plasticine on the windows, and then we switched to situations where she's ODing in several places. So I would not have been surprised if she ended up in a motorcycle gang and, holding people up or whatnot. But even though the poem has the title in it, was cluing me in, I had forgotten about that by the time we got to the ODing. So I was expecting a different type of narrative. So I really enjoy that it's like a real life exposed in there, because obviously she didn't have to share that part of herself. And I think for a lot of people that struggle with not ready for primetime things, and perhaps feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm ever going to be socially acceptable in one way or another, I think that's a really valuable journey that this poem is taking, of a narrative. Not that you have to be successful in that way, but that there is an other side of how you choose to go.
Absolutely. And I mean, there is something, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how we tend to, if we don't realize, say, that, our professors of creative writing are also writing books, or probably if you're taking, painting classes, there could be a gallery exhibition of, painting by your professor. But then when you actually see that work, the artistic renderings of the people who teach you more about doing those artistic renderings, it's a whole other level of revealing their humanity to you, because we fall into, even when we know this, and even when it later becomes us and we're in those jobs, there's a way in which the person almost feels like, you're here to help me learn a particular skill, but we forget that, in that moment, like, oh, but you're still human and you still come with all of your memories and all of your past traumatic experiences and all of those things. And if those are also reflected in some way in your art, then that can be really illuminating when, a student or someone who only knows you, as the person in the front of the classroom, or the person, like in some sort of job that may feel distant and remote to them, when they get confronted with your humanity through your art. And we know very well that with poetry, even when the poet is explicitly creating personas and explicitly saying, this is not me, this is not my direct experience, that there's a lot of conflation that happens with authors and the speakers in the poem. But in Suzanne's case, I've not known Suzanne to be someone who has really tried to overly eschew that distance. Like, she's been very honest that a lot of what she writes about is very autobiographically rooted. And of course, she went on to become known by her other name, Suzanne Antonetta, as a creative nonfiction writer. So you can almost feel the incipient memoir sensibilities here that started in lineated poems. And then while I was her student, she went on to publish her first, but certainly not her last book of prose, Body Toxic, an environmental memoir. So she was also for me a role model that, oh, you can toggle, you can be a poet, you can be a creative nonfictionist. And in fact, she was the first professor that I had and person I knew who was actively doing both. There may have been other people who were being poets and creative nonfiction writers, as I knew I wanted to be, but she was the first person where it was like, here's Bardo, and the next year, here's Body Toxic, and so forth, going also extending into fiction as she's continued writing. So now she's my multi-genre, hero. But you can feel the incipient memoir here, and you can feel the vulnerability here, and how honest that is to put out into the world, also where your own students may be reading it, as you were teaching them. So that was a revelation to me as well.
I love, I think the speaker makes a reference to the bored students' eyes. I love that. You know, as a teacher myself, you're scanning the room and you see those dead eyes. It's
Yes, and sometimes it's not your fault. It's when the class meets. It's how tired they are. Have they had anything to eat? How many bus rides have they been on to get here? But we know that moment, right? And it also struck me as very honest and humble to have a speaker acknowledging that your students can look at you with bored eyes, and that there's that it's not perfect, and she's saying, like, tenure means held, like the university wants to hold on to you. So also you're now in this in a different way. Like, your commitment, even to those bored eyes, is it's reinforced when you get tenure. So I love that it's honest. It's not romanticizing the early days with the partying and the drug use. It's not romanticizing the bored student eyes that are sometimes looking back at her. And it's not even making, excuses for why they might be bored. But I can say, having lived in Bellingham when I was Suzanne's student, that in the winter, it's not that far south of Alaska, and it is pretty much dark. Like, those descriptions about like the day just being a slightly different tint from the nighttime is just, it's not even illumination, it's just a slightly different tint. It's so dark between like November and February that sometimes, depending where you live and how heavy the tree cover is, you might not get a feeling of true light until like 10 o'clock. And then you feel like night is coming on at like 2:33 in the afternoon. So the students are also, it's that seasonal affect shift too. Like, we know it's winter, we know it's cold. We may or may not realize just how little light there is in this place setting, but I love how like viscerally attuned to like making us see that plasticine on the neighbors' windows, the frost, the leaf meal, like the way everything is like freezing and crusting, and the way also that is reflected perhaps in how alert your students are. They're not basking in South Florida light all day.
I also really enjoy the title of the poem in contrast to the poem itself. Even as a now middle-aged woman myself, past 40, whenever I hear a woman of 40, a narrative of a woman of 40, automatically in my brain, due to my societal conditions, it clicks in. I'm like, oh, this is gonna be boring, like boring. And then the poem and the speaker themselves are so spicy that I love the contrast of the banal title with what's happening in the poem. That's not banal at all, even though on its surface it's a very sort of stilted, pantyhose on, powder blue suit, situation, which we're all been in, where we're trying to be very official and impress somebody else on another side of a desk. That there's so much more coming into this. The speaker's whole life is coming with them, and I really enjoyed
that.
it.
Like the banal like aspect of how also, I mean, still a revelation for me then was like the idea that like, wait, so like professors still have to check the thermostat and the pilot light and get their flues clean. Like you still have to do all this domestic, stuff that doesn't seem like, if you're putting the arts up on a pedestal, as I obviously was, like don't professors just sit around all day and just read poems and write poems? Like they have to deal with this too. They have to do winter proofing of their homes. They have to do, and that's for me the beauty of a Suzanne Paola poem in general. And the other poem I almost read from this book is about going to the grocery store at a grocery chain we have on the West Coast called Fred Meyer, but it's kind of like, it's a little Costco-esque because it's not just groceries, it's like a mega store, but kind of before we had it, before Costco caught on. But she titles the poem Seeing It All as the Bardo, like that intermediary state in Tibetan Buddhism. But the poem begins that she's going to the modern fiefdom of Fred Meyer. So like the whole poem takes place in essentially a store that's very much like a Costco, where you can get groceries, you can get, patio furniture, you can get your eyes checked. There's a playground area for your kids. Like you can do everything in this one modern fiefdom, but it's in and of itself, it's really banal, right? Like it's not like going to do your errands doesn't seem inherently like poem worthy, or winterproofing your home doesn't seem poem worthy. And Suzanne just blew my mind with that. Like I thought a poem coming in when I was 22 years old, I thought a poem, and I guess mostly I'd been reading more archaic poetry, but I just thought it had to have an occasion that was very grand. Like the occasion can be love, it can be grief. Can it be tenure? Okay. But can the poem also have in it really beautifully orchestrated, elegantly written attention to things like chores? Wow, you can do that. You can teach and write a poem that has teaching in it, because that seemed like somehow like, but that's just your job. Like, wouldn't your poem be about like these higher things? But it turns out all of these things are the higher things. They're the impossible moments on our necklace. So I love that she showed me what you can write about and how it can all be rendered beautifully, even when it should be by rights boring. And like, I wouldn't want to have to do that chore. So why would I want to read about that chore? But now I only want to read about the chore, and I still don't want to go to Fred Meyer or clean the, well, we don't really have to deal with the same winterizing issues, but you know what I mean? Like you would rather read the poem than even do the things that the poem references doing, because it makes you see them in a new way. And then of course, when you're doing them in your own life, you're going to think about them and hear the voice of the poem, which is actually a comfort.
So let me ask you, when you pick this book up, do you read the book from cover to cover, or do you go to your favorite poems first?
The first time, and also before I got more practice reading whole poetry collections, because I think that's another thing too, that I'm actually trying to work against a little bit in my undergrad teaching. But in my own undergraduate teaching, we rarely read whole books by the same poet. We read anthologies, and we were assigned, this week it's these poets, go to this section, maybe 8 or 10 poems by each poet, maybe 4 to 5 poets a week. So you're getting the length of a book, like maybe 50 or 60 pages of poems a week, but they weren't all by the same poet or necessarily written as part of the same collection by the poet. So now, when I've read a whole poetry book, I will certainly dance through the book again, and I'll jump to different places, and I'll reread certain poems over and over. But when I first come to a book of poetry, and I still very much do this, but in the old days, when this was probably one of maybe 10 books of poetry by a living poet that I had read, in its entirety, and like a book that had just come out 3 years before I got my hands on it. That was pretty rare because I had mostly been reading deceased poets writing long before. So the fact that you could even have like Fred Meyer in a poem or Tenure in a poem was unfamiliar. But to sit down with the book and think about, it was the first time I ever had to think like, how did they put their book together? So I wanted to read it in that order. And I still read for that question because I'm always thinking, how can I learn more about different ways to put together, a book of poetry that I'm working on, or a book of poetry I'm helping a student work on? So like I'm reading it as a writer too, right? Like how did this book come to be? But then I want to jump. And that's the beauty for me. It's like you get the narrative experience of the book, like how did they order this? And then you get the lyric experience of the book, which is like going back and leaping to the poems that maybe mystified you or enchanted you, or both. And then you can stay with those poems longer or read backwards to forwards or in different patterns. But I do like to read a book the first time like, okay, how did they make these choices, and really like pour over the table of contents and look at like what clues are here about what I should expect, and then also what are maybe deliberately placed surprises, so that, because as we know, right, we love a pattern, but then we also love a pattern that breaks. So how is the writer setting up my expectations, satisfying them, but then also breaking them in a way that like surprises me and kind of thrills me, like those moments of like, we thought maybe it would be boring, like there's pantyhose in this poem, but then it's like it's not boring at all. And I don't want to put on pantyhose, but I totally get it.
uh, Pantyhose, new pantyhose, the bane of my existence while I lived up north. Oh my god, tights and pantyhose, the horror. Yes. That it's funny that you were talking about how a book was put together, because just this past weekend, I started to send out queries for a full-length poetry collection, which somehow came together. Actually, due to the pressure of some competitions, because some competitions were coming up, and I'm like, I have to enter this competition, but it required a full-length poetry collection. So therefore, I had to get it together, put it together. And then I think I was in bed, and I woke up and I went, oh, wait a minute, am I transitioning between this section and this section? Well, I don't know, So that speaks to how a poetry book is put together, that someone reading it might not even think about.
Yes. Yes.
So I want to ask you if there's anything else burning in your mind that you want to mention about this poem.
There is, and I'm very excited to hear your poem too. And I know we're going to hear resonance anyway, because these serendipities always occur. But I guess the last thing I should mention is I was really interested in college, and have remained really interested in braided forms. And I think as an undergrad, it was the first time I'd heard anyone use the term braided essay, but I had never applied that idea to a poem. And so it strikes me as I read this poem out loud, and I've read it a few times this week in advance of this meeting, thinking about the poem, and I realized like how I love that there's this braiding of not just like, okay, what do you do when you're trying not to obsess about going up for tenure? So, you're dealing with your winterproofing your house, et cetera. And, you're commending yourself for like, you're thinking about how you're not thinking about anything else. And then you're thinking about, you're giving yourself that credit. So you're still thinking and obsessing, but you're trying to do it less about the big milestone that's coming. And like, you hope you get it, but you're trying not to, let that dominate all your thoughts. So I feel that desire to stay in a more like, these references to Buddhism, and to like, trying to be more accepting and like clear the mind and not obsessed, but the mind still wants to be thinking. But then there's also this narrative thread that comes in of the woman on the television. And I love how like when you're trying to let your mind just be free, or there's like a meditative impulse here to like, I'm not thinking about it. Okay, well, I'm thinking about how I'm not thinking about it. Like when you're trying to free your mind, really surprising things also pop into your mind that you suddenly remember, and you don't know exactly where they came from, but they suddenly feel, germane to the moment. And the fact that she keeps having this flashback to having, we don't know where in the speaker's history, the woman on the television is talking about this near-death experience, and how she's describing like, the body and the soul and how they're connected, and she has all these metaphors for how she's talking about it. We're in like a flesh suit, but we're each a piece of spirit, and these things that, like, this could have been a doctor's waiting room, this could have been our home TV, this could have been anywhere, but like those little things that lodge and suddenly feel like it came out of nowhere, but it's so relevant. So I was really struck, even though I may not have 20 plus years ago connected it with the braided essay, that the speaker is also thinking, I've had these near-death experiences too, even though I didn't talk about them as near-death experiences. But then this woman who's clearly being interviewed on television about, having gone toward the light and come back from the light, and like, what was that like? And that voice is the way things collect in our minds. So this stranger through the television has this narrative about, surviving a near-death experience. And it's now in this speaker's head as she's remembering her near-death experiences, as she's getting ready to go up for this formal occasion. And the woman, like if you were looking at the poem, the woman from the television speaking, her lines are italicized. And so the very last line of the whole poem is a standalone single line stanza that says, like gloves or something, it just comes off. And you suddenly realize that it's just the visual signal of those italics. This is back to the woman on the TV speaking about the way that the body and the soul like uncleave, but it's just done in this really elegant, simple way. And you realize like, wow, this speaker's voice and this woman on the television's voice, they have blended, and it's only the italicized signaling that lets you see that. So like, it really like, that it just it was a beautiful moment of like braiding something, and then when you braid it and then you tie the knot at the bottom, or the ribbon at the bottom, the poem comes together like in that masterful way. And I felt it, and I was like, oh, like not just the power of the necklace of impossible moments, but like, oh, this is how you can make a poem that is longer and more intricate and braided come together. Like it felt so satisfying aesthetically. So the young poet in me was galvanized by that ending.
I think the way you expressed that and you went, to me, that is the way I select these poems. And I read poetry every week on my Instagram as well. And the way I pick them is because they make me go, in some way or another. I just read Kiki Petrosino's Elegy. And when I reread that, it was just, there was so much being revealed to me in the reading, and as I practice it to read, and in the rereading, and it was just more and more and more. And I think that's what, the poems that I choose, they keep giving me more and more. So when I read them, even if it's probably the 400th time, I'm still getting something unexpected and new.
Yes, that gasp moment, like the gasp
Yes.
worthiness. And I know this about you from the way that you talk about poems. It is also like with attention to the gasp.
That's a new term. Attention.
It is. We're going to coin it. Attention to the
Yes.
gasp. But it's a real, like it's a palpable moment where you go, like you feel it.
Yes. One last question about how you read. Do you frequently find yourself reading them aloud?
Yes, yes. So if I'm reading a book and it's just my first foray, right? Like, so I'm going to read all the way through. I'm going to be very odd to say this, but kind of mathematical, but maybe it's Virgoian. But like, I like to come to the text, I always need a pen. I don't even feel like I'm reading if I'm not interacting with the text and writing in some way, but like, I like to do things that look odd. I think sometimes to my students, like I like to number, if the table of contents, it's not the page number, but like the number of actual poems, are there sections, how many poems per section, like to sort of see the mathematics, but really it's like the ratios, like how does this writer like proportion this book? Is there one giant poem at the middle and then a series of smaller poems in sections 1 and 3? Or is there, is there like a hinge poem like that? Or is it some other structure? So I really like to be kind of mathematical and intentional that way, and really like mark up the poems as I'm going, like for looking for, oh, this is how this poem links to another poem, or this is an echo of a theme or a sonic kind of echo, like a sound pattern I'm hearing throughout the book. But I also feel really open, like after I kind of do my mathematics, I'm willing to come back into a book and sort of you know, what are the poems that I feel like definitely need to be read out loud? What are the poems? And then sometimes that's every poem. You know, some poems seem like they're page poems, maybe because there are, you know, even like I'm thinking of like Susan Howe's, you know, highly experimental poems where like language overwrites other language, and I'm not even technically sure how to read it, or some parts of it are obscured or redacted, so I'm not sure exactly how to read it out loud. But unless the poem is giving me really strong I'm a page poem signals, then I want to be able to go back and read poems out loud and kind of like linger in them, and also see how they change from my way of marking them as a written text to like an oral text, because that gets us back to, you know, what most but not all poems are in their essence, right? Like an oral document. So I do like to read poems out loud, and especially with others, like, you know, with students. But I mean, I'll read to my cats, I'll read alone, but it's, you know, like that feeling of like when we can read a poem in class, sometimes, as you well know, as a teacher and a student, you get to hear the gasps. You also get to be there for somebody else reacting that way, and that's the coolest way to read a poem, is to have, or someone else is reading it and you hear it differently because they're reading it out loud.
I if I'm just reading the text, my brain tends to wander. So I do tend to read out loud because it keeps me on track, and it also allows me to hear sonic things that are happening that I might not notice
Yes.
if I'm just reading silently. I do have to mention that when I started to read my work in public, it never occurred to me that the people listening would really interact with me reading. And then sometimes you're reading and then you might not be at the end, you might be in the middle or whatever, and then you hear a gasp or something, or oh, or and it's so startling to hear people reacting to something emotionally, to something that you've read, when I'm trying my very best to maintain my poetry voice.
It's a really nice, I mean, I've been in the audience when you've read and I've heard that happen, or people suddenly start clapping because they're moved, or snapping because they're moved by something, and you think like, wow. It's so there's a like a loose line between a poetry reading and like a spell casting, like you have a kind of, you can have that effect on an audience where they're suddenly, it's almost hypnotic, where it's, they're responding physically in their chairs.
So true. And can you repeat the name of the poem and the collection it comes from?
Absolutely. So the poem is called Tenure at 40, and the collection is Bardo. The author is Suzanne Paola, and I can also mention, so it did win the Brittingham Prize. Of course, I looked that up because I didn't know what it was when I was just entering graduate school. But the Brittingham Prize is an incredibly prestigious prize sponsored by the University of Wisconsin Press, and it is still an annual prize that you can submit poetry, full-length poetry collections to. And one thing that really stunned me, because I'm also, my Virgo sensibilities are not only the ones that make me want to mark, counting like numbers of poems and sections, but also I like to read the things that aren't officially the book, but like all of the back matter and front matter. And I was shocked. And I remember the moment and just being like, oh, I'm plugging into some larger literary world here, that a poet I had read in college when I was taking contemporary poetry classes, but they were literature focused. So we weren't writing poems, but we were reading poems and writing about them. And it was very valuable to do that, of course, and I loved it. But we had read a lot of poetry by Donald Hall, who even then was, a very senior, very distinguished poet. And, I thought of him as like, kind of a, an elder of the poetry community, which he still is. Just even much older, but at that time, I mean, still such a distinguished and long-standing poet with so many collections. And I read him only in an anthology at the time, but he was the final judge who chose Suzanne's book. So that when you look at the series in the back, and it tells you like who has judged every Brittingham Prize, since the inception of the series, and I looked and I saw Donald Hall had chosen Suzanne Paola, it was like this light went on where I thought, okay, so first of all, that writer whose work I really enjoyed in my class, it was reinforcement that that writer was alive. Shocking, because most poets, in high school, everyone was not alive, not contemporary. So like, here's Donald Hall, who's kind of, an already feeling like a legendary figure in poetry land. He like reached out of his legendary status and picked the first book first full-length book of poetry by this poet who now happens to be my teacher and later my thesis director, like someone I actually met and got to work with. How that like passing of a torch, that this senior poet is acknowledging and recognizing the genius of this, burgeoning poet who, then I'm going to study with the burgeoning genius poet who was chosen by the senior poet. And like that feeling of being part of a lineage of like, we're all alive and we're all in this together, that crystallized for me when I looked at that list of like, who are the people who have judged this prize? And many of the older poets who had judged it, I had encountered in my contemporary, like my 20th century American lit class, but just like, oh wait, they're alive, but they're not just alive writing poems. They're like reading the work of other people and choosing books, and like that's a thing, and that's how the torch gets passed on. And because of him choosing this book, now I have it in my hands. And Suzanne, of course, goes on to judge contests in many genres, and then another book exists in the world because she chooses it, and then I'm studying with her and I'm part of that. And that was astonishing to me. That was so exciting.
I mean, it's really wonderful how that mentorship functions within the literary community. I remember when I first came to FIU, I was completely dazzled by Richard Blanco and his status as one of Barack Obama's inaugural poets. And I was in such a frenzy and a fit over him that when I took his first class, I submitted these two awful poems because I was trying so terribly hard that I made them extra awful. So, I gave him these two awful poems because it was a literature class, not a poetry class. And the next class I took with him, he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you should apply to the Cave Canem Fellowship Program." And I just looked at him and I thought, have you read those poems? I mean, but just him seeing something in me and passing that torch, to say, no, you can do it. You go on and you do it. And now here I am doing it. Then I could never imagine even putting together any kind of full length anything collection. That just seems completely ridiculous. But that's how it works. And, one passes on to the next one, which leads me to my favorite story about you, Julie. Well, one of them. I have many. But when I was putting together my memoir, I was trying to get out of my own head and to select books that were popular at the time or could be read. And I asked you, Julie, what were you reading about these years, about these specific years? And I'll never forget, you said, yeah, I was in the fourth grade. So that's what you get from having a mentor that's younger than you. And I'm pretty sure that exchange happened in email, but I can hear it in my head.
I completely forgot that. And that's so funny. And then I'm thinking like, now, of course, you're making me think like, well, what was I reading in the fourth grade? What was going on there? Because but yes, like that is the strange thing with time, right? And like we're all in these spaces together, but we may be very different ages or come from very different literary backgrounds, and so like what we were reading when we were in the same time in our lives could be so different. That is really funny.
So you did give me good insight. I think you said something about Jane Eyre, and I was like, oh yeah, that's
That's funny. That's
good.
the first book just moments ago that came to my head, where I remember thinking that someone said to me, like in third grade, I had read all of Lucy Maud Montgomery, like not just the Anne of Green Gables, but like all of it, the Golden Road, like the whole thing, everything with her name on it. And so that was deemed sort of like, well, you're a girl in elementary school, so reading Lucy Maud Montgomery makes perfect sense. But then I remember the next year was when I started going for the Brontes, like the bigger books, and they were maybe even the same size, but like the print was so tiny that they were clearly, exponentially larger than the Anne of Green Gables books. And people were saying like, well, I don't know if are you ready? In fourth grade, are you ready for Jane Eyre? And I remember thinking, I am ready. I'm going there. Like, I want to see what this big, like, Victorian novel stuff is about. So yeah, I guess fourth grade was actually the beginning for me of the really big books, like, Jane Eyre, and then Wuthering Heights, which I remember feeling like I didn't quite get it. And then I kept going back to it. And finally, like in high school, something with that book clicked. And I was like, oh, I've evolved to where I feel I can connect to Wuthering Heights.
I do have to say that when I go back to those books, the type is frighteningly small.
So tiny.
It's just like, oh my goodness, it's thick and the type's small. Um,
And there's not
I
a
have
lot of room for marking. I want to be able to mark more, which is why we need the spacious pages of poetry, There's more room in the margin.
true. So I'm going to take this opportunity to start to talk about my poem that
Please
I brought
do.
today, which is 2 Miles Away by Margaret Atwood from her collection, Two-Headed Poems. Okay, 2 miles away. 2 miles away, the humid weekend jerks in thin lights along the highway. Bumper to bumper, groups and separates at the corner store, which could be anywhere. But this is the hinterland. Layer of grass, layer of lukewarm dirt, layer of stones, layer of winter. Oblongs of earth edged with fences. In the middle of each, two sleepers. Night rises from their bodies and spreads over the hills, musty, smelling of thunder. The air around their heads thickens with ancestors. This is a land of hope fulfilled. This is a desert. Like deserts, it is nocturnal and planted with thorns. Outside this house, the hammock weaves one tree to another. For once, there is no wind. Sandbox in moonlight, the glimmer of shadowy toys, the green shovel, the cracked white pail, the red star. In the turned furrows around our bed, wild carrots, pinkish mauve and stealthy, creep over the rug, the cleared space, an invasion of savage flowers, reclaiming their lost territory. Is this where I want to be? Is this who I want to be with? Half of a pair, half of a custom, nose against neck, knee thrown against the soft groin, part of this ancient habit, part of this net, this comfort, this red-black night, humility of the sleeping body, web of blood.
Wow. I didn't know. I had a hunch you might read a Margaret Atwood poem, given your deep and enduring love for Margaret Atwood's work. But I want to know why you chose that particular poem, since, of course, you have so many to choose from in her canon.
Well, I chose this poem and I was really struggling very hard between this and Ada Limon. But I ended up choosing this one because I was a teenager. I was working at the Strand bookstore in New York, and I had come across Atwood through her novels, and I was slowly consuming everything Atwood. So I think I had gone through probably all of the novels and the short stories, and then I was starting with the poetry. I remember being a little bit surprised that she had a poetry collection. So this was the one that was available in the Strand that they had there. And at that time, I was reading other poets. I recall I was reading Marianne Moore. I had the complete collection, which had a pink cover on it. And I would read these poems and I think, oh my goodness, I love this. There's so much going on here. I don't know how to pick this apart. I don't know what they've done. They're doing amazing things with words, but I don't know what they're doing. And this was the first poem that really resonated with me, but the language was simpler and I could see what she was doing. And it made me feel like, oh, you can make poetry this way with these type of words. I can do that. So I think this poem, as I recall, this poem was the impetus of me starting to write my my own poetry, because I felt like this was the entryway, because the other poems I was reading, with their indented lines, and I'm like, well, when do you indent a line, and when does the stanza stop, all of these things going on that were beyond me. This poem was accessible, it was beautiful, and it was accessible to me. So it's become a touchstone for me, poetry wise. So that's
I
what I think.
mean, I now that I've heard you read this poem, I have to say it makes me think about um, when we teach intro, which I believe you're teaching right now, but when we teach those introductory classes for first time creative writers, how wonderful this poem is. I mean, here by this incredible, sophisticated, multi-genre writer, but that accessibility and what also comes through listening is how concrete it is. Because I'm always taking notes when I'm listening, but the flashes of the people, places, and things in the poem. So often in an intro class, our students come in and they're like, I want to write big, important things, understandably. So they gravitate toward all those abstract nouns and not knowing the thing that you discovered in this poem of like, oh, there is a way to make a poem that uses some simpler language and can make that language sing. And I'm thinking of how if I were teaching this poem, like just the gloriously ordinary concrete details of like, but a sandbox in moonlight, and then taking the time to point out the colors of the pail, the shovel, and the star. And then I was like, oh, that thing, that star that you put, it's like a cookie cutter, but it's in sand, not dough. It was so specific, and there's a green and a white and a red. It's just incredible how naming in a deliberate way the ordinary things of the world, now we're seeing them, but they're glowing in moonlight. It's very stunning, and I think a poem I could imagine like bringing to students and sharing.
I love this poem because, first of all, there's something, she always does sonic things. She's very tricky. Um, so she has a big vocabulary, and like, so I'm going along reading the poem, and then she says, "This is the hinterland." So hinterland is not a word you use in normal speech, you know. So I love how she throws that in there. And then I think I heard this term from you, plain song poetry,
Oh yeah, yeah.
where you're using ordinary language, but you're manipulating it sonically to create these very beautiful uh, oral patterns, which she does all the time. And one of the other things I enjoy about her is sometimes the way she describes things. She doesn't directly describe what she's talking about. It's almost like she's looking slightly away from it. So when she says, the humid weekend jerks in thin lights along the highway, she's obviously talking about traffic and cars, but she doesn't say traffic and cars. The humid weekend, so we know it's on the weekend and they're caught in traffic, but she is not directly looking at the cars and the traffic. She's looking slightly askance. And then when she talks about the children, there's children around, but she doesn't talk about the children. She talks about the toys and the specificity of the toys and the colors. So obviously, if there's a sandbox in the backyard, there's children that live there, but she doesn't specifically put her finger on them. And I love that about her. I guess I love her quirkiness, and I love her trickery, because she does all kinds of things all the time that are unexpected.
Yes.
And when she said, because at this time I was also really enamored with Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. And I mean, basically, Alice Walker and Margaret Atwood were some of the women I aspired to. So they wrote everything. They wrote poetry, they wrote nonfiction, they wrote fiction. So I just thought that's what a writer did. So that's what I decided to do. It wasn't like I made a choice or I thought about it. That's what they did. So that's what I wanted to do. And when she talked about night rising from their bodies spreads over the hills, musty, smelling of thunder, and then the air around their heads thickens with ancestors. To me, talking about ancestors was unusual for a white woman poet. That was more of something you would hear from a poet of color.
Yeah.
And the fact that I remember, like, I was startled by that. And I thought, oh my goodness, there's very Toni Morrison here. And, she does things like this all the time. So, and whenever I read this, I know I'm talking a lot in a block, but I love, specifically, one of the things I really love about this is how she goes from the ordinary, and then she has her voltas, her turns, and then she's slowly slipping away she's turning her attention away from the ordinary. And to me, it starts where she's like, talks about the ancestors, like, oh, okay, so we're tilting away a little bit from reality. And then when she sort of goes back to the ordinary, when she's talking about the toys and the shovel, the cracked white pail, the red stars. But then when she hits the rug, wild carrots, pinkish mauve, and stealthy creep over the rug. Now, Margaret, this is where she's taken out her poetic license and she's waving it around. I mean, that is just all kinds of balls, like the carrots were not stealthily creeping over the rug, but she's telling you they are. So she's letting you know something else is happening here that is not ordinary.
Yes.
And all of this happening in this very ordinary space. The weekend, we're going away from the weekend with the kids, and we've got the traffic, and we've got the hammock. But something else is happening here. And to me, this goes back to the poem you were reading, where she was talking about, pantyhose and powder blue suit. These are the ordinary things of our lives. But there's something else there. There's something extraordinary in the ordinary. And so we're reading along, and oh, this is all very nice, and oh yes, and okay. So now there's the rug, and strange things are happening to the rug, with the rug. And then she says, "Is this where I want to be?"
Yes,
Is
big
this
volta.
who I want to be with? And I'm like, what? Wait a minute, So we're talking about a very nice, ordinary weekend that's humdrum and humid, and now we're wondering if we want to be here with this person.
Yeah.
And to me, she switches and she's questioning the relationship. And I love that she does not name the genders.
Right.
So, but she makes it very obvious this is an intimate relationship. Nose against neck. Knee thrown against the soft groin. And to me, she's questioning, why are we in relationships? Why do we have kids? Is this what I want? So to go from where we started, in the humid weekend to, is this who I want to be with? Do I even want to be part of Western civilization's concept of relationships?
Yes.
And then in the last stanza, to me, she just like brings everything together, is completely off the rails, part of this ancient habit going back to, the lineage of marriage and coupling, part of this net, this comfort, this red black night. And then she keeps going. Humility of the sleeping body, web of blood. So it's like she starts here. It's almost like a game of telephone. And then she connects her words, and then she ends up in a complete other space that's talking about humanity in general versus a relationship. So she goes pretty far.
She does. I see what you mean about our poems being in conversation even without us planning or knowing at all, like that scope. And the necklace of impossible moments for Paola Speaker, to me, I mark that as my heartline, part of this ancient habit like the ancient habit of marriage or partnership or coupling or even just being with other humans in flocks or families, some kind of notion of that constellation of people being together, that it so feels like the necklace of impossible moments. Like, how did we get here? Not just the journey to the, weekend cabin, but like, how did we get here in our relationship? And then how did we get here in the history of relationships? That giant scope that also fits into, in the scheme of things, a relatively short poem, given that these are topics that could fill books and books and books and books. So there is compression, but there's also like this beautiful sprawl. I love that you chose this poem. And also the thing that you said about how she sort of like winds us up through the ordinary to get to the extraordinary. She's a conjurer. Like how she's not saying exactly what the thing is that's happening or that we're looking at, but she's making us see it without naming it exactly, so that we feel that we're in the traffic, but she's not saying these are cars, or we feel the presence of children, but she's not saying children are here. That's conjuring. That's like so powerful. And I hadn't thought of the fact that, yeah, that is what she's doing, right? All the way through is the thing that we're looking at is conjuring something else that might be cars or children, but it might also by the end of the poem be, marriage, like a word she's not using, or partnership, a word she's not using, but that certainly now we can't stop thinking about it. It's been conjured.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was reading this poem with my students, and they noticed something that I had not. Earlier in the poem, she talks about oblongs of earth edged with fences. So when I read that, I'm like, yes, the yard edged with fences. But they said, is it the yard? Because it's oblong. And I went, oblong? It's not rectangle, So that startled me. And I think she is talking about the yard. But the fact that she picked oblong, which is a shape that it's probably not, like my brain hooks on that. And I thought, I don't know about, so that's like a point of mystery in the poem for me. And she uses my beloved semicolon in the poem. And I don't know if you've noticed, Julie, semicolons are really taking it on the chin. There is like a fraction of people who despise semicolons.
I know I have met some semicolon haters. I just love that the semicolon. Now, I should preface this by saying that I understand that sometimes when you're making a poem or a text that might be more unconventional on the page, that the semicolon visually does not always serve how people want a line to be. So sometimes in a poem, right, someone might say, like, I know a semicolon would link these two sentences, but I don't want to impose it. I want to let them, like the elements of fragmentation, or what we would call a run-on sentence in prose, it might work in a poem because of a certain kind of fluidity of the line that people want. That said, I love a semicolon because it gives you that hybridity between, I'm giving you more than a comma, but I'm not giving you as much as a period. And essentially, I'm putting the period on top of the comma. So I'm giving you hybrid punctuation to bring your sentence closer, so that it's like two sentences, but they're not as separate as if a period or other end point punctuation were stopping them. So period, question mark, exclamation point. No, it's a semicolon brings them a little closer, but it's also like more formalized than just the comma, just the little pause, right? Like it does something that is so unique in like grammatical structures that the Virgo in me just can't not love the semicolon. Like I can't, it feels different than just saying, I'm going to put a period here and have two sentences. It allows them to be closer.
I've always loved the semicolon. When I learned about it in grammar class, I always thought they were great. And this collection came out in 1978. So I think people's concept of punctuation was different then. I don't think the semicolon was so fraught.
Wasn't a battleground piece of punctuation yet. Not in the same way. No, I haven't had people like, in the early days, I don't remember any rage at the semicolon that I sometimes feel is present now in a room, like, this outrage of what is the semicolon up to? But it's kind of a sneaky punctuation, and she's got those sneaky, really savvy things going on. So it kind of makes sense there would be semicolons.
She does. And do you subscribe to her Substack?
I do not. Unless,
I
wait, did you by any chance send it to me?
Yes, I did.
I did. If you send it to me, what's odd is that all of a sudden, 2 months ago, I didn't know what a Substack was. And now I think I'm subscribing to maybe 8 or 10, but I think it's been that other people have told me and then I've forgotten that I've signed up. So then when a Substack arrives, I think, oh, great miracle, what is this? And then I'm discovering, oh, that's because someone else. So I didn't have a concept to like go to Substack wherever it lives, I guess probably at like substack.com. But other people have been connecting me. And every time someone says like, I'm adding you or put your email address in here, I've done it, but it comes to me, right? I don't have to go to it. Like,
Yes, no, it will come to
okay.
you. I think it's a good way of connecting. And don't go to Substack.com because you'll end up down a rabbit hole and all kinds of things will be popping up in your email box. Definitely go on the recommendations of other people.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if you saw this on her Substack. She shared, she had in her papers a letter I believe her agent had written about her to somebody else. And he said something like her nickname is Peggy. Is Peggy a nickname for Margaret? I think it is, which is ridiculous, but I'm
It's
not even gonna go
very
there.
surprising. When I learned that as a child about a church woman who went by Peggy but was in the church directory as Margaret, it just blew my mind. I could not accept this.
Yes. So he called her Peggy. And then somebody was commenting on the characters in her books and her stories that they were a little off center. And then he said something like, well, that's because Peggy's a little off center herself. She is quite mad, you see. Something like that. Um, so I thought, oh yes, I am inaugurated into the fraternity of the mad women, because I always say about myself that I'm completely crazed. Um, that's why I gravitate to her so much.
Mhm.
And this particular poem is not only a touchstone for poetry, just when I have to write almost anything, especially if I'm not in the mood, because sometimes we have to write things, we're on deadline and we're not in the mood. I will read this poem to sort of, loosen the gears and get myself going because it just does what it's supposed to do. And I've probably read it 401 times, counting today, easily. And I never get tired of it for whatever reason.
I have to
Um,
tell you, Yael, I would love to read essays by you about poetry. And I mean, I know that's also become a more popular, lots of books of what we would think of, as creative nonfiction, but they're really focused on poetry. And it's like an essayist taking us through their personal relationship with poems. I would love to read that project from you, like the poem, and how the poem interacts with your life. Maybe it includes your teaching, maybe it includes the memories of when you first encountered the poem, but I want to be part of that, like a poem journey, basically what this new venture is doing, in the audiovisual sphere. But like, I would love to read you focusing our attention on specific poems and also, kind of speaking, like braiding an essay around them. I mean, that's really thrilling for me with writers who are comfortable in poetry and prose, but using prose to elucidate poetry. That's my wheelhouse. I love to read that kind of work.
okay, so I just wrote it down. It'll go on my list.
Yes,
And
that's what
I
I'm looking
have
for.
to say, I ran into the students at a recent event of Florida International University, and they were startled that I was not a poetry major with my MFA. Like startled, like you didn't make a full collection at FIU. You weren't a poetry. It's like no.
That's,
But
I
I'm
mean,
a
that's,
poetry ambassador.
you are a poetry ambassador. And that's the, I mean, that's the value too. Like the prose training allows you also then to write about whatever you want, but including poetry in prose. And sometimes I'm convinced that for people who are trepidatious about poetry, you know, who just feel like, well, obviously, like I know how to read, but I'm uncomfortable when the lines start breaking. That makes me nervous. I don't know if I'm going to understand it. I feel like the sneakiest way, so in an Atwood inspired way, to get people who maybe don't always read poetry, even if they're avid readers of prose, to get them like more open to poetry is to have, you know, someone who is clearly invested in poetry and prose open the door to poetry through prose. That's something that really stands out to me. I'm reading a book right now called Poetry's Possible Worlds by Leslie Wheeler, who is a poet whose work I love, but now I'm reading her do prose about other people's poetry, but I'm learning a lot about her too. But just the reflection of how other people come to love poetry and also how to be poets in prose. For a lot of readers, that also makes it less scary to encounter a poem because you have like a prose guide to take
Mm.
you into that poetry. So it's not just like, oh, there it is, and the lines are broken funny, and I don't know what's going on, what's happening here. Like there's a guide in prose, and I feel like you obviously could write those kinds of essays, and I would love to read them, but I would not be the only one who would love to read them.
Well, I mean, some of the poems I can wax ecstatic about for a very long time. And even the ones that confuse me, like some poems I read and I'm not sure what's going on here. I still don't know if I like this, but you know, there's something about this poem that fascinates me. And you know, like I keep coming back to it.
Yeah.
So Julie, thank you so much.
Thank
Um,
you.
can people go to your website to find the variety of your published works and where to get them?
They can. I need to update with the last couple of projects, but the bulk of them are there. And then, you know, I guess it's either the website or just Googling Julie Marie Wade, and it's there. So I need to get, that's reminding me, I need to get Fugue,
Yes.
which just came out up on the website and a little link to it, but it is out in the world now. So it's not like in a pre-order state. It's in an order state. I will get it on the website, but the general, you know, stuff about me and stuff that I've written and published is definitely there.
Okay. And my website is yaelaldana.com. You can find out stuff about me there. And interestingly, I want to make this a podcast, but I don't know how. So I'll have to find that out.
I don't know how people make podcasts either. Like, do you have to have a microphone with a big spongy top? Like, I don't know how it works, but I enjoy a lot
That
of
would be
podcasts.
helpful. And my son has one of those with like a mounted arm. So
Oh,
but
I
I
like
think
it.
you could extract the sound and just do it that way, which I will do. So I am going to post this shortly. We
Okay.
got more unwieldy than I thought. So I think I'll post two versions. I think I'll post an edited, more pointed version and then an expansive, wonderful, unwieldy version
I love it.
um, on my YouTube and then podcast as soon as I get my podcast boots on.
Sounds good.
So thank you so much, Julie Marie Wade, for joining me on the inaugural episode of Each Bring a Poem. And I will see you soon.
Thanks, Yael.